The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the sidewalks of downtown Manhattan into rivers of gray despair. Marcus Whitfield pulled his cashmere coat tighter around his shoulders as he emerged from the gleaming glass towers of Whitfield and Associates, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the wet pavement with the precision of a metronome. For 18 months, his morning routine had been as unchanging as the sunrise black coffee from the corner cafe. A cursory glance at the financial headlines on his phone and the 12-minute walk to his penthouse office where deals worth millions were orchestrated with the cold efficiency of a surgeon's blade. And for 18 months, she had been there. The woman sat huddled against the brick wall of St. Catherine's Church, wrapped in layers of tattered fabric that had long since lost their original colors. Her shopping cart, filled with the sum total of her earthly possessions, stood sentinel beside her like a faithful guardian. Marcus had never looked directly at her. Not really. She existed in his peripheral vision like background noise, as much a part of the urban landscape as the fire hydrants and parking meters that lined his route. Today, something was different. Perhaps it was the way the autumn wind carried the scent of her desperation, sharp and bitter like unshed tears. Perhaps it was the way her thin shoulders shook with each labored breath, or how her fingers, blue with cold, clutched a photograph so tightly that her knuckles had turned white as bone. Marcus found his perfectly calibrated stride faltering, his businessman's armor of indifference cracking like ice under unexpected pressure. "Spare some change?" The voice was barely a whisper, raspy from disuse, and the cruel bite of countless nights spent under unforgiving skies. She didn't look up as she spoke, her eyes fixed on the photograph in her hands, with the intensity of a prayer. Marcus felt his hand move instinctively toward his wallet, then freeze mid-motion. His father's voice echoed in his memory, sharp and disapproving. "Never encourage them, son. Give them money, and you're just enabling their choices." But as he stood there, raindrops forming a halo around the streetlight above, something in the woman's posture, the careful way she held that photograph, as if it contained the last ember of hope in a world gone cold, made him pause. "Ma'am?" His voice surprised them both with its gentleness. She looked up then, and Marcus felt the breath leave his lungs in a rush. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and endless. But behind the weariness lived something he hadn't expected: intelligence, dignity, and a soul that hadn't been completely extinguished by whatever circumstances had brought her to this corner. She was younger than he'd assumed, perhaps 40, with dark hair streaked with premature silver that caught the light like scattered stars. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, lowering her gaze. "I didn't mean to bother you." "You're not bothering me." The words left his mouth before his rational mind could censor them. Are you all right?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. She studied his face with the wariness of someone who had learned that kindness often came with hidden costs, searching for the trap that surely lay beneath his concern. "I'm Elena," she said finally, her voice gaining strength. "Elena Vasquez. Marcus." He found himself crouching down to her level, his expensive suit absorbing moisture from the wet pavement. "Elena, when did you last eat something warm?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her free hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, and Marcus noticed how loose her coat hung on her frame, how the sharp angles of her cheekbones spoke of hunger that had become a constant companion. "Tuesday, I think," she admitted, then quickly added, "But I'm fine. I get by." Tuesday. Today was Friday. Marcus felt something twist in his chest, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. When had he last gone 3 hours without food, let alone 3 days? He thought of the untouched sandwich that sat on his office desk, the elaborate lunch meetings where he picked at $1,000 wines while discussing quarterly projections. "There's a diner 2 blocks from here," he heard himself saying. "Maria's Kitchen. Do you know it?" Elena nodded slowly. "I know it. Used to take my daughter there for pancakes on Sunday mornings, back when—" Her voice trailed off, and she clutched the photograph tighter. "Would you let me buy you breakfast?" The offer startled her into silence. She looked at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. her gray eyes wide with disbelief. Why would you want to do that? It was a fair question, and one Marcus wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Why did he want to help her? In his world, transactions were clear: quid pro quo, mutual benefit, calculated outcomes. But sitting here on the rain-soaked sidewalk, looking into Elena's eyes, he felt something that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten it existed. Simple human compassion. Because you're cold and hungry, and I have the means to change that, at least for one morning. Elena studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus found himself holding his breath. Finally, she nodded, a small, tentative gesture that somehow felt like the most important agreement he'd ever negotiated. Okay, she whispered. Okay. The diner was a relic from another era, with red vinyl booths and chrome fixtures that had seen better decades. The smell of bacon and coffee hung in the air like a warm embrace, and Marcus watched Elena's eyes close briefly as she breathed it in. They found a booth in the back corner, away from the curious stares of other patrons, who clearly wondered what a man in a $3,000 suit was doing with a homeless woman. Order whatever you want, Marcus said, sliding the laminated menu across the table. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, and Marcus pretended not to notice the way her eyes lingered hungrily on every item. When the waitress came, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and sensible shoes, Elena ordered with the careful precision of someone who knew this might be her only real meal for days to come. Pancakes with blueberries, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and coffee, she said, then hesitated. And could I maybe get some orange juice too? Of course, the waitress smiled. And for you, hon? She asked Marcus. Just coffee, he replied, then noticed Elena's disappointed expression. Actually, make that 2 orders of the pancakes. I find I'm hungrier than I thought. As they waited for their food, Marcus found himself studying Elena with the same attention he usually reserved for merger documents. There were stories written in the lines around her eyes, tales of laughter and sorrow that spoke of a life fully lived before circumstances had stripped her of everything familiar. The photograph, he said gently. Is that your daughter? Elena's hand moved protectively over the worn paper. For a moment, Marcus thought she wouldn't answer, but then she turned the picture so he could see it. A young girl with Elena's storm-gray eyes smiled back at him, gap-toothed and radiant, wearing a school uniform and clutching a small stuffed elephant. Isabella, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. She would have been 12 last month. Would have been. Marcus felt the weight of those words settle over the table like a shroud. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it with a depth that surprised him. She was everything, Elena continued, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. Smart as a whip, wanted to be a veterinarian. She used to bring home every stray animal she could find. Cats, dogs, once even a pigeon with a broken wing. A smile ghosted across her features. I called her my little St. Francis. What happened? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Leukemia, Elena said simply. 2 years of treatments, experimental drugs, everything we could try. The medical bills, she shook her head. I lost my job because I couldn't keep up with the missed days. Lost the insurance. Lost the house. But I thought if I could just hold on long enough, if I could find a way to pay for the treatments. She didn't need to finish. Marcus could fill in the devastating blanks, the impossible choice between rent money and medicine, the gradual slide from middle-class stability into desperate poverty, the way the system that should have caught her instead let her fall. She died in my arms at the county hospital, Elena whispered. The last thing she said was, I'm sorry, Mama. I'm sorry I cost so much. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought of his own mother, who had passed 5 years ago, surrounded by the best medical care money could buy, in a private room filled with flowers and soft music. He thought of the foundation she'd started in her honor, focused on cancer research, tax-deductible donations that made him feel virtuous without requiring him to see the faces of those who suffered. Their food arrived, but Elena didn't touch hers immediately. Instead, she sat staring at the steaming plate, as if it might disappear if she looked away. "Elena," Marcus said softly, "please eat." She picked up her fork with reverent care, cutting a small piece of pancake and chewing it slowly, her eyes closing with something approaching bliss. Watching her savor each bite, Marcus felt ashamed of all the meals he'd consumed without thought, all the food he'd left untouched on plates in expensive restaurants. "These are perfect," she said after several minutes, "just like the ones I used to make for Isabella on snow days." "You cooked?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about her life before homelessness had redefined her existence. "I was a nurse," Elena said, pride creeping into her voice. "Pediatric ICU at Children's Memorial. I loved those kids, fought for them like they were my own." She paused, fork halfway to her mouth. "After Isabella died, I couldn't be around sick children anymore. Every face I saw was hers." Marcus nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. After his mother's death, he'd thrown himself into work with manic intensity, using 18-hour days to drown out the silence where her voice used to be. But he'd had his company, his wealth, his support system. Elena had faced her grief alone, with nothing to catch her when she fell. "How long have you been?" He struggled for the right words. "On the street? 8 months now. Some nights I sleep at the shelter, but it's not always safe, especially for women. That corner by the church, it's quiet. Father Martinez, he lets me use the bathroom in the mornings, sometimes brings me soup. 8 months. Marcus calculated quickly. That meant she'd been there when he'd started his new routine after changing office buildings. She'd been watching his polished shoes click past her every morning, seeing his world of privilege and power from her position on the cold ground. The thought made him profoundly uncomfortable. "I have to ask," he said carefully, "why haven't you applied for assistance? Social services? Disability? Something?" Elena's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "You think I haven't tried? The waiting lists are months long, and that's if you can navigate the paperwork without an address, without identification that hasn't been stolen or lost. The system's designed for people who still have a foothold in society, not for those of us who've fallen through the cracks." She took another bite of pancakes, then looked directly at him. "You want to know the hardest part? It's not the hunger or the cold, it's becoming invisible. People look right through you, like you're not even human anymore. You start to wonder if maybe they're right." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. How many times had he looked right through her? How many mornings had he passed by, so absorbed in his own concerns that he'd forgotten there was a person sitting just feet away, struggling to survive? "I'm sorry," he said, and the inadequacy of the words hung in the air between them. "For what?" "For not seeing you sooner." Elena studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus found himself hoping he might pass whatever test she was conducting. Finally, she reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture so unexpected and profound that it sent electricity shooting up his arm. "You're seeing me now," she said simply. They sat in comfortable silence while Elena finished her meal, and Marcus found himself really looking at the diner for the first time. The other customers weren't the faceless masses he usually filtered out. They were individuals with their own stories, their own struggles and triumphs. The elderly man in the corner booth nursed his coffee, with the careful attention of someone stretching $1. The young mother at the counter bounced a fussy baby while calculating whether she could afford dessert. The teenage waitress smiled at everyone, despite the exhaustion in her eyes, probably working to help support her family. When had he stopped seeing people as human beings and started viewing them as obstacles or opportunities? When had his world become so insulated that genuine human connection had become foreign to him? "I should let you get to work," Elena said, dabbing at her mouth with the paper napkin. "Thank you for breakfast. I'll remember this kindness." "Wait," Marcus said, the word escaping before he could stop it. Would you mind if I walked you back to your corner?" Elena tilted her head, considering. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I want to." They walked slowly through the morning bustle, Marcus matching his pace to Elena's careful steps. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The way she navigated around puddles to keep her worn shoes dry, how she nodded politely to the shop owners who knew her by sight, the dignity she maintained despite her circumstances. When they reached the church corner, Elena settled back against the brick wall with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this space home. She arranged her few belongings carefully, creating a small sanctuary of order in chaos. "Marcus," she said as he stood awkwardly nearby, clearly reluctant to leave. "Why did you stop today? Really?" He considered lying, giving her some noble speech about civic duty or Christian charity. But something in her gray eyes demanded honesty. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I finally realized that walking past you every day was killing something inside me that I didn't know I still had." Elena smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. Despite the hard lines worn by grief and hardship, she was beautiful. Not in the polished way of the women in his social circle, but with the kind of beauty that came from surviving hell and still believing in heaven. "Will you?" He hesitated, feeling foolish. "Would it be all right if I stopped by tomorrow? Maybe brought you coffee?" "I'd like that," she said softly. As Marcus walked the remaining blocks to his office, he felt as though he were seeing the city with new eyes. The homeless man sleeping in the doorway of the bank, the woman sorting through trash cans for bottles to recycle, the veteran holding a cardboard sign at the traffic light. They weren't problems to be ignored anymore. They were Elena, each with their own stories, their own photographs clutched tight against their hearts. His assistant, Jennifer, looked up in surprise when he walked into the office 30 minutes late, something that never happened in the precisely ordered world of Marcus Whitfield. "Sir, your 9 o'clock meeting is already waiting in the conference room," she said, eyeing his slightly damp suit with concern. "Reschedule it," Marcus said, surprising them both. "In fact, clear my calendar for the morning." "Sir, I need to make some phone calls." "And Jennifer? I want you to research every homeless shelter, food bank, and social service organization in the city. I want names, contact information, current funding levels, waiting lists, everything." Jennifer's eyebrows rose, but she nodded efficiently. "Should I ask what this is regarding?" Marcus paused at his office door, thinking of Elena's weathered hands clutching Isabella's photograph, of the way she'd savored each bite of breakfast, as if it were a communion wafer. "A new investment opportunity," he said finally. "The most important one I've ever made." Over the next 3 weeks, Marcus's mornings took on a new rhythm. Coffee with Elena became the highlight of his day, 30 minutes of conversation that grounded him in ways his meditation app and expensive therapy sessions never had. He learned that she spoke 3 languages, had a master's degree in nursing, and could recite entire passages of poetry from memory. She learned that beneath his perfectly pressed exterior lived a man who had forgotten how to connect with anything beyond stock portfolios and profit margins. "You remind me of Isabella sometimes," Elena said one crisp October morning as they sat on the bench Marcus had quietly donated to the church. "She used to ask so many questions about everything. Why is the sky blue, Mama? Where do thoughts come from? If you could have dinner with anyone in history, who would it be?" "Smart questions," Marcus replied. "What was your answer to that last one?" "My grandmother. She raised me after my parents died. Taught me that dignity isn't something anyone can take from you. It's something you choose to keep." Elena's voice grew soft with memory. "She used to say that the measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can help them, but how they treat those who can't." The words hit Marcus with uncomfortable precision. By that measure, what kind of person had he been for most of his adult life? Success in business had taught him to network upward, to cultivate relationships that served his interests. When had he last spent time with someone who couldn't advance his career or increase his wealth? "Elena," he said carefully, "what would you say if I told you I might be able to help you find work? Real work, with benefits and housing assistance?" Her face went very still. "I'd say that sounds too good to be true, and in my experience, things that sound too good to be true usually are." "I've been making some calls," Marcus continued. "Children's Memorial has a new initiative for experienced nurses who've been out of the workforce. They provide retraining, counseling support for trauma, and transitional housing during the program." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she turned away, struggling to compose herself. "Marcus, I can't." I haven't worked in almost 2 years. My license has lapsed, my references are gone, and I have 20 years of experience saving children's lives," he interrupted gently. "The program director, Dr. Sarah Chen, she's willing to meet with you. No commitments, just a conversation." "Why?" Elena whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the morning commuters hurry past with their coffee cups and smartphones, each absorbed in their own urgent concerns. A month ago, he'd been one of them, armored in importance and scheduling conflicts. "Because you taught me something I'd forgotten," he said finally. "That every person has value that can't be measured in dollars or productivity. And because I think Isabella would want her mother to have a chance to help other children the way she couldn't be helped." Elena's composure finally cracked and tears streamed down her cheeks. Marcus handed her his handkerchief, a small, old-fashioned gesture he'd learned from watching his grandfather, and waited while she wept for the daughter she'd lost, the life she'd left behind, and the possibility of hope she'd almost stopped believing in. "I'm scared," she admitted when the tears subsided. "What if I can't do it anymore? What if I see those sick children and I fall apart?" "Then you'll put yourself back together, one day at a time," Marcus said. "And you won't do it alone." The meeting with Dr. Chen was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Marcus offered to drive Elena there, but she insisted on taking the bus, a small assertion of independence that he respected. Instead, he arranged for her to have access to the church basement for showering in borrowed professional clothes from Jennifer, who turned out to be exactly Elena's size. On Tuesday morning, Marcus found it impossible to concentrate on quarterly reports and merger negotiations. His mind kept drifting to Elena, imagining her sitting in Dr. Chen's office, fighting for a chance to reclaim her life. By lunchtime, his nervous energy had infected his entire staff. "Mr. Whitfield," Jennifer said during their afternoon briefing, "you've rescheduled the Morrison contract review 3 times, and you asked me to research pediatric nursing programs instead of reviewing the Henderson acquisition. Is everything all right?" Marcus realized he'd been drumming his fingers on his desk, a nervous habit he hadn't displayed since his first job interview 20 years ago. "I'm fine, Jennifer, just waiting for an important phone call." When his cell phone finally rang at 3:15, Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Elena's voice was thick with emotion, but this time the tears were different. "Marcus, I got it. I got into the program." Relief flooded through him so powerfully that he had to sit down. "Elena, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you. Dr. Chen said the program starts next Monday. There's a studio apartment in the transitional housing complex, and they'll help me get my license renewed. Marcus, I'm going to be a nurse again." The joy in her voice was infectious, and Marcus found himself grinning like a fool. "You were always a nurse, Elena. Now you just get to remember how good you are at it." That evening, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He left the office before 8 p.m. and walked the long way home, retracing the route that had brought Elena into his life. The corner by the church looked different now, just another patch of urban sidewalk, rather than the epicenter of someone's survival. Father Martinez was tending to the small garden beside the church entrance, and he looked up as Marcus approached. "You're the gentleman who's been bringing Elena coffee," the priest said, straightening with a slight grimace. "She's told me about your kindness." "She's an extraordinary person," Marcus replied. "I just helped her remember that." "And what did she help you remember?" Father Martinez asked, with the directness of someone accustomed to hearing confessions. Marcus considered the question seriously. That being wealthy and being rich are 2 different things entirely. On Sunday morning, Marcus attended Mass at St. Catherine's for the first time since his mother's funeral. The service was different from the sterile formality of his childhood church. Here, families crowded into worn pews, children whispered and fidgeted, and the congregation's voices rose in hymns that spoke of struggle and redemption rather than prosperity and status. During the prayer requests, Father Martinez mentioned Elena by name, asking for continued blessings on her new journey. Marcus felt a swell of emotion he hadn't experienced in years, the joy of being part of something larger than himself, connected to a community that celebrated each other's victories as their own. After the service, he found Elena waiting by the garden, dressed in the borrowed suit, but somehow looking more like herself than he'd ever seen her. Her hair was clean and pulled back in a simple bun, and she'd found lipstick somewhere that brought color back to her face. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted with a laugh. "But the good kind of terrified, you know? Like when Isabella used to climb too high on the playground equipment. Scared, but excited to see what happened next." They walked together to the bench that had become their regular meeting spot, and Marcus realized this would likely be their last conversation in this context. Tomorrow, Elena would begin the process of rebuilding her professional life, moving into transitional housing, reclaiming her place in the world. The homeless woman who had taught him to see clearly would disappear, replaced by Nurse Elena Vasquez, pediatric care specialist. "I want you to know something," Elena said, settling beside him on the bench. "These past few weeks, having someone believe in me again, it's saved my life in ways that go beyond housing and employment." "You saved mine too," Marcus replied, and meant it completely. "I was drowning in my own success, suffocating on achievements that meant nothing to anyone but my accountant. You reminded me what it means to be human." Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. "I want to give you this," she said, placing it in his hands. Marcus unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small wooden cross, obviously handmade and worn smooth by countless fingers. "Elena, I can't take this. It must be important to you." "It was Isabella's," she said softly. "She made it in Sunday school the year before she got sick. I've carried it everywhere since she died, but I think she'd want it to go to someone who helped her mama find her way back to helping other children." Marcus's throat tightened. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Besides, I have something better now." She tapped her temple. "I have hope again, and memories that make me smile instead of just cry. I have a future that includes more than just surviving until tomorrow." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city wake up around them. Street vendors set up their carts. Early commuters hurried past with purposeful strides, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. It was an ordinary Sunday morning, unremarkable except for the extraordinary transformation it represented. 2 lives forever changed by the simple act of seeing and being seen. "Will you come visit me sometimes?" Elena asked. "At the hospital, I mean. I'd like you to see me in scrubs again, saving babies instead of just getting by." "Try to keep me away," Marcus said. "In fact, I've been thinking about expanding the foundation's work. Maybe funding a program that helps medical professionals who've experienced trauma get back into practice. I'd want you to help design it, of course." Elena's eyes widened. "You'd want me to help with that?" "I can't think of anyone more qualified to understand what people in that situation need." As the morning grew warmer, other parishioners began to emerge from the church, and Marcus noticed how many of them stopped to speak with Elena, offering congratulations and promises to visit her at the hospital. She wasn't invisible here. She was part of a community that had watched over her during her darkest time and now celebrated her return to light. "I should go," Elena said finally, though she seemed reluctant to leave. "I want to get everything organized for tomorrow, and I promised Dr. Chen I'd review the orientation materials." They stood together, and for a moment, neither seemed sure how to say goodbye to this chapter of their unlikely friendship. Finally, Elena stepped forward and embraced Marcus, a real hug, warm and grateful, and free of the tentative caution that had marked their early interactions. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." "Thank you," Marcus replied, "for teaching me how to look." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the pediatric ICU of Children's Memorial Hospital, watching through a window as Elena bent over a tiny patient's bedside. She was in her element, confident, compassionate, every inch the skilled professional she'd always been, beneath the layers of grief and circumstance that had temporarily obscured her gifts. The program had been a remarkable success. Elena had not only completed her recertification, but had been offered a permanent position as a senior nurse and patient advocate. She'd moved from transitional housing into a small apartment near the hospital, complete with a balcony garden where she grew herbs and flowers in memory of Isabella. "She's exceptional," said Dr. Chen, joining Marcus at the window. Her patient outcomes are among the best we've seen, and the families adore her. There's something about having been through real loss that makes her especially gifted at helping others navigate their fears. Marcus nodded, watching Elena demonstrate to worried parents how to hold their premature son without disturbing his medical equipment. The baby was tiny, barely larger than a doll, but Elena's hands were steady and sure as she facilitated those first precious moments of connection. The Foundation's trauma recovery program, Dr. Chen continued. It's already changing lives. We've had 6 more professionals apply, people who thought their careers were over after personal tragedies. Elena's success story is giving them hope. Through the window, Marcus saw Elena look up and catch sight of him. Her face lit up with a smile that transformed her features, and she raised her hand in a small wave. The wedding ring on her finger caught the light. She'd married a widowed teacher she'd met in her apartment building, a gentle man named David who understood grief and healing and the preciousness of second chances. She invited me to Thanksgiving dinner, Marcus said to Dr. Chen. Can you imagine? 8 months ago, she was living on the street, and now she's hosting dinner for 12 people in her apartment. Found family, she calls them. Other people who've been through hell and came out the other side. Will you go? Marcus thought of his usual Thanksgiving routine, catered meal for one in his penthouse, eaten while reviewing quarterly projections. Wouldn't miss it for the world. That evening, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He left the office before 8 p.m. and walked the long way home, retracing the route that had brought Elena into his life. The corner by the church looked different now, just another patch of urban sidewalk, rather than the epicenter of someone's survival. Father Martinez was just locking up after evening service, and he waved when he spotted Marcus approaching. How is our Elena? The priest asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. Thriving, Marcus replied, absolutely thriving. And how are you, my son? I haven't seen you at service lately. Marcus considered the question seriously. The truth was, he'd been busier than ever. Not with mindless acquisition and wealth accumulation, but with meaningful work that required his attention at odd hours. The Foundation's expanded mission meant site visits to other cities, meetings with social workers and medical professionals, and grant applications that demanded careful consideration. I'm different than I was, he said finally. Better, I think, more awake. Father Martinez nodded approvingly. Sometimes God puts angels in our path disguised as people who need our help. But the real miracle isn't the helping. It's the way being needed changes the helper. As Marcus continued his walk home, he reflected on the priest's words. He'd always thought of his success in traditional terms: net worth, market share, industry recognition. But now he measured his days differently. How many lives had been touched by the Foundation's work? How many professionals had been helped back into careers that served others? How many families had been spared the devastating choice between medical care and financial survival? His phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. David's making his famous tamales for Thanksgiving dinner. Can you handle some spice in your life? Marcus smiled, typing back. Bring it on. I'm not the same man who only ate bland food anymore. It was true, he realized. The Marcus Whitfield, who had walked past a homeless woman for 18 months without seeing her, had been replaced by someone who understood that real wealth came from connection, purpose, and the profound satisfaction of using privilege to lift others up rather than to build higher walls around himself. The city looked different to him now as he made his way through the evening crowds. Every face told a story. Every person carried dreams and disappointments, hopes and fears that deserved recognition. He couldn't help everyone. No one could, but he could see them, acknowledge their humanity, and use his resources to create systems that caught people when they fell, rather than stepping over them when they landed. In his penthouse apartment, Marcus poured himself a glass of wine and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. Somewhere out there, Elena was finishing her shift at the hospital, probably stopping by the rooms of patients who had no family visitors, offering the kind of presence that healing required. Somewhere, a newly homeless person was spending their first night on the streets, terrified and invisible. Somewhere, a healthcare worker was questioning whether they could continue in a profession that demanded everything while offering little support when personal tragedy struck. Tomorrow, Marcus would return to his office and continue the work of building bridges between those who had fallen and those who had the power to help them rise. It wasn't enough to simply write checks. Sustainable change required systemic thinking, policy advocacy, and the kind of patient relationship building that turns strangers into allies. But tonight, he would call his brother in California, a relationship he'd been rebuilding since learning from Elena the preciousness of family connections. He would review the applications for the Foundation's next round of grants, each one representing a life that could be transformed with the right support. And he would frame the small wooden cross Elena had given him, placing it on his desk where it would remind him daily that the most profound victories came from seeing the sacred in the ordinary, the valuable in the discarded. The rain had returned to Manhattan, painting the windows with silver streams that caught and reflected the city lights. But Marcus no longer saw rain as an inconvenience to be avoided. Like Elena had taught him, precipitation could nourish as well as flood, wash clean as well as muddy. Everything depended on whether you were prepared to be changed by the experience of getting wet. As he prepared for bed, Marcus found himself thinking about the photograph Elena had clutched so desperately during their first conversation. Isabella's gap-toothed smile and bright eyes, forever frozen in a moment of pure joy. That little girl's death had initially destroyed her mother's faith in goodness and possibility. But ultimately, Isabella's memory had become the foundation for Elena's return to purpose, driving her passion for saving other children and preventing other families from facing impossible choices. In a strange way, Marcus thought, Isabella had saved them both. Her brief life had created the circumstances that brought him and Elena together at exactly the moment when they needed each other most. Elena needed someone to believe in her possibility for renewal. Marcus needed someone to wake him from the spiritual sleep that success without purpose had created. Tomorrow would mark exactly 1 year since that rainy morning when Marcus had finally stopped walking past the homeless woman who would change his understanding of everything that mattered. In 12 months, they had both been transformed. Elena from invisible survivor to celebrated healer. Marcus from successful businessman to purposeful human being. The city never slept, and from his windows, Marcus could see the lights of the hospital where Elena worked, the church where Father Martinez offered sanctuary to anyone who needed it, and the countless buildings that housed people whose stories he would never know, but whose lives deserved the same dignity and possibility that he took for granted. Closing his eyes, Marcus whispered a prayer of gratitude, not to a distant deity who controlled outcomes, but to the mysterious force that had synchronized two desperate needs at exactly the right moment. Elena had needed someone to see her humanity when she'd forgotten it herself. Marcus had needed someone to show him that humanity was the only currency that truly mattered. In 3 days, they would gather around David's dining room table with a collection of people who had found each other through shared experience of loss and recovery. Elena would tell stories about her patients, victories. David would share his students' achievements, and Marcus would describe the latest family helped by the Foundation's programs. They would give thanks not for avoiding hardship, but for surviving it and being changed by it. The first winter storm of the season was predicted for Thursday, and Marcus found himself thinking about all the people who would face that cold without adequate shelter. But now, instead of feeling helpless guilt, he felt motivated purpose. The Foundation had just approved funding for an emergency heating program at 3 downtown shelters, and Elena's hospital had agreed to station nurses at warming centers during extreme weather events. Change, Marcus had learned, happened one relationship at a time, one act of recognition at a time, one moment of choosing to see rather than to look away. Isabella Vasquez had lived only 11 years, but her legacy was growing stronger every day. In the children her mother now saved, in the professionals the Foundation helped return to service, in the systems being reformed to catch people before they fell, rather than stepping over them after they hit the ground. Standing at his window as the city prepared for sleep, Marcus touched the small wooden cross on the windowsill and smiled. Tomorrow he would walk past St. Catherine's Church on his way to the office, but this time he would stop and check on the new memorial garden Elena and Father Martinez had designed in Isabella's honor. He would bring coffee for the volunteers who tended it, just as he had once brought coffee to a woman who had taught him that being truly wealthy meant having something valuable to give away. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean for whatever miracles tomorrow might bring. And in pediatric rooms across the city, children slept peacefully under the watchful care of a nurse who had learned that sometimes the greatest healing came not from preventing loss, but from transforming it into love that multiplied itself across countless other lives. Marcus Whitfield, who had once walked past human suffering with practiced indifference, now fell asleep planning ways to ensure that no one else would have to choose between medicine and rent, between dignity and survival, between hope and despair. He had found his true calling not in accumulating wealth, but in circulating it toward the broken places where it could work miracles of restoration and renewal. And somewhere across the city, Elena Vasquez tucked Isabella's photograph into her nurse's bag, ready for another day of carrying her daughter's memory into rooms where other families faced impossible choices. She had learned that love didn't end with death. It transformed, becoming a force that reached beyond personal loss to touch lives she would never have encountered if grief hadn't first broken her heart wide open. 2 lives, intersected by chance and changed by choice, now rippled outward in ways that would touch countless others. The millionaire had stopped walking past, and in that stopping, both he and the woman he had finally seen had discovered that true wealth was measured not in what you could buy, but in what you could heal, not in what you could own, but in what you could restore. The city slept, but love remained awake, working through human hands and hearts to write new stories of redemption on every street corner where despair had once seemed to have the final word.